There are some special considerations you have to think about when adapting long telephoto lenses to your Micro Four Thirds or other mirrorless camera. Let me show you how to do this. So adapting a vintage telephoto lens onto your mirrorless camera, your Micro Four Thirds camera, is pretty straightforward. I mean, it's really just like any other vintage lens. You've got to have a lens mount adapter. In this case, I have a Nikon F to Micro Four Thirds adapter. Fits right on the lens. Once I have that, then this will mount on the camera. Really just like any vintage lens. There's nothing really magical about physically putting this on the camera. That's pretty straightforward. But there's some other things we've really got to think about to do this and be successful at it. So today I have 6 tips on how to use these long telephoto lenses on your Micro Four Thirds or really any other mirrorless camera. And so I want to show you these today. This is an old Nikkor H 300mm f4.5 lens. These are available reasonably priced. They have pretty decent image quality, and so it's a great lens. I'm also going to be talking today about this old Vivitar 80-210 Series 1. These were known in their day to be really sharp, really excellent lenses. And this one actually is in M42 mount or Pentax screw mount, so I've got a mount adapter that threads onto it just like I would for any other M42 or Pentax screw mount lens, and so it's easy to mount on the camera. So let's talk about how to do this. So like I say, I've got 6 tips on how to do this that'll help you get the lens mounted, get it on the camera, and use it successfully without having some issues. So let's get started with tip number 1. Okay, tip number 1 is really kind of a safety concern, and I'm not talking about your personal safety. I'm talking about the safety of the camera and the lens. So this lens is a heavy lens. I mean, these were made, back when they made lenses with brass and heavy aluminum, and of course the glass elements. There's a pretty big pieces of glass in there. This lens is pretty heavy. Today's camera bodies are largely not nearly as heavily duty constructed. Is that a word? Heavily duty? Heavily constructed as cameras were back in the 60s and 70s, when this lens was made. So a lot of today's camera bodies are made of polymer or, much lighter construction if they are metal. And, just simply hanging this lens on the front of a camera with it mounted on a tripod or a monopod, or even hanging from the straps, could potentially cause damage to the camera. If you were just to put a tripod under this camera with this big heavy lens hanging off of it, you likely would either rip the tripod mount out of the bottom of the camera or possibly even damage the lens mount. So it's real important that you understand that the camera, which is pretty lightweight, can hang on the lens just fine, but the lens is where the support needs to happen. So this lens actually has 2 tripod mounts. Some have a rotating collar, and interestingly enough, some don't have anything. So we're going to talk about that. So what we want to do is make sure we're supporting the lens. Even when you're carrying this with a neck strap and you're wearing it, don't just let it hang from the neck strap with this big heavy lens on it. Even if you've got a neck strap on, hang onto the lens. Let the lens support the camera body, not the other way around. Now, if I put this on a tripod or a monopod, I can screw it into this lens mount. If I want to shoot vertical, unfortunately, I got to, move it and mount it. Some lenses, like I say, have a rotating tripod collar. That's real convenient. And so you just want to make sure you're mounting the lens, so that the lens is supporting the camera. Now, on lenses that don't have any kind of tripod support, of course, handheld is fine. You can just hand hold it. But if you're wanting to support it, one of the things that I found is really helpful is this monopod. Now, this monopod is actually interesting. It's made by a company called Primos Hunting Equipment or Gear, and it is really kind of a neat monopod. It's got a trigger thing that you can adjust the height on it. It's got this cradle on the top of it it's actually made for setting a rifle on. But what it's really kind of good for is to rest a lens on. And that little V-shaped thing will hold the lens while you're taking pictures. Now, it has a strap. You can actually, it's rubber. You can stretch it over the lens and you could actually hook it on. I would not, even if you do that, I would not just consider that you could turn loose of the camera. That's going to end up with your camera on the floor. But if if you need to be able to cradle the lens, you can do that with something like this, and it'll give some support to the lens, so it's not just hanging from the camera body. I even with a lens that's this is not that huge a lens, but it's, if you were to pick it up, you'd go like, man, that's a pretty heavy lens. It's got some pretty heavy glass in it, and like I say, that's construction inside is going to be brass and aluminum, very little plastic on this thing. So if I were to put this camera on a tripod with this lens hanging on it, I probably would damage the camera. That's bad. So this little monopod's kind of cool. You can rest your lens on it, and it's real quick. You can, walk around the tripod or the monopod and just rest the lens on it and take your pictures. And it's real easy to adjust height. This trigger thing makes it really kind of cool. You can also, I've got this cranked down pretty tight. You can take this little V-shaped thing off here, and you could put it on a tripod. It's got a 1/4-20 mount on the bottom, and so if you wanted to use this on a tripod, you could. You can also mount a ball head on here if you wanted to have a ball head instead of the V-shaped thing for using like with that other lens. I can just put a ball head on it. So it's a pretty cool little deal. Actually, you can get these at sporting goods stores, like Cabela's or Bass Pro, or here in Oklahoma, we have a line of store called Academy, and they have hunting stuff, and so it's a neat monopod. It's two-sectioned. It's got another longer section down here that you can pull out, and then this easy adjust section here, so you can adjust it for whatever height you need. And just a great little monopod. While it's made for a rifle, it's actually really good as a general use monopod, and with that cradle, it works great for supporting heavy lenses. So that's tip number one. Make sure you're supporting the lens, not the camera body. Don't let the weight of that lens, don't let the camera support the weight of that lens, because you could easily damage your camera, and you don't want to do that. All right, tip number two is making sure you get your image stabilization set up. Now, Olympus cameras have some really amazing image stabilization. The in-body image stabilization, or IBIS, in Olympus cameras is just amazing, and it really helps with long lenses. So on my camera here, I can actually set it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Let me down here. I can actually set it at the focal length of the lens. You press your info button, and then you can actually scroll up and down and change that setting so that it's matches the focal length of the lens. And it's really helpful. So when you're hand holding, or even if you're working off of a monopod, but especially when you're hand holding, it's going to make the image more stable. It'll allow you to hand hold at much lower shutter speeds than you might without image stabilization. So, the old rule of thumb with full frame film cameras and these lenses was that you had to have a shutter speed that was pretty much the same as your focal length. So if you're, if you have like a 210 millimeter lens, the minimum shutter speed you'd want to use would be about a 250th of a second. Well, the image stabilization is going to allow you to handhold probably 3 or 4 stops slower shutter speeds than you would be able to without. So make sure, that's tip number two, make sure you get your image stabilization set up so that you're taking advantage of that camera's ability to help you stabilize the image. Okay, tip number three is, do I have to use a viewfinder, or can I use a camera with a screen? And the answer to that is you can do either one. I often like to use, with longer lenses, I like to use a camera that has a viewfinder. I don't know, it's just kind of a throwback to the old film cameras. It just seems natural to hold it to your eye and use the lens. But I've also found that with cameras like this EP5 that I can use the screen. But I don't actually tend to hold it in front of me and look at the screen. Actually, what I do is I tend to tilt the screen up and hold the camera down low and look down at it, and then I can kind of clamp my arms against my sides and brace the camera and hold it very steady. That way, I'm going to see if I can step back. You can see that. So I'm basically, I'm looking down at the camera, but I've got my arms kind of braced into my sides, and I can look through the camera and look at the screen. And I've actually found myself able to follow like birds and things like that in flight by doing that, and it actually works quite well. So if you have a camera that doesn't have a viewfinder, that doesn't mean you can't use long lenses. I like doing it both ways. So if I happen to be using a camera like this EP5, I don't have any problem at all using the screen. If I use a camera with a viewfinder, that works fine too. So if you have a micro four thirds camera like one of the EPL series or the EP series, and all it has is the screen, you can go buy a accessory viewfinder, but you really don't have to. With a little bit of practice, you can actually use that screen quite effectively. So don't let that deter you. Okay, tip number 4. Let's talk about focus. Now, you've got to manually focus these kinds of lenses, and that's just the way it works. But we did that for a long time with film cameras and did it quite successfully. Now, I won't discount the fact that today's modern autofocus telephoto lenses are amazing when it comes to focus. That's great, but they also cost a lot of money. Some of the long focal length lenses can be quite pricey. So one of the things that some people do, while we're talking about one versus the other, is that they'll buy a manual focus or a vintage lens and see if that's a focal length that they want or really can use and need. So if before I drop a lot of money on a 300 or 400 millimeter autofocus Olympus lens or something, I could buy a vintage lens like this for maybe $100 and try that focal length out, see if it's something that's really useful to me before I spend the money on an autofocus version. And like I say, I'm not going to discount the fact that the autofocus lenses are amazing. No question of that. But you can also do quite good work with these lenses, and with a little bit of practice, you'll learn to focus. Now, on these cameras, you're going to want to use either focus peaking or the magnifier to fine-tune your focus. Kind of depends on what you're shooting. If you're shooting things that are, like wildlife, birds, things that are moving more quickly, the focus peaking is the way to go. And every camera, of course, it sets up a little bit differently. I've got my camera set up so I've got a button here right next to the shutter button that turns on the focus peaking. When I look through the viewfinder, it highlights in white outline anything that's in focus, and I can very quickly fine-tune my focus and take my shot. And so that works quite well. If I've got the camera on a tripod and I'm really wanting to critically focus, I'll use the magnifier to magnify the image, and then I can critically focus and take my picture that way. So you can do it either way. For action stuff or stuff that's moving, the focus peaking is a lot faster. And if you're shooting sports or something that's really moving, you can actually just look through the viewfinder and focus and get your focus accurate. It's not that hard to do. You don't have a focus aid like the film cameras used to have. But a lot of professional photographers back in the film days would get cameras with focusing screens that were just ground glass. They didn't have any focus aid, and they just learned to focus off the ground glass. And you can do that in your viewfinder. You can fine-tune the focus. But the focus peaking, I find, is really, really handy. So that's probably what I use most of the time, is the focus peaking. But if I've got the lens on a tripod and it's a static subject, I'm not worried about time constraints, then I'll use the magnifier to really zoom in and critically focus. So, it's something that's going to take a little bit of practice. But the cool thing with digital is you can take all the practice shots you want. It doesn't cost you like film does. So get out and practice using the lens, practice focusing. And the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And pretty soon you'll find yourself able to get those shots with the focus just nailed. So practice. That's the next thing. Tip number 5 is exposure. With a vintage lens on a mirrorless camera, you're probably going to want to run it either on aperture priority or manual. I find aperture priority is probably the easiest. So if I put the camera on aperture priority, then I'm going to set the aperture on the lens that I want to use, and the camera is going to give me the correct shutter speed for that. I can see that in the viewfinder, and I can keep in mind how slow a shutter speed I can handle based on the lens and the the image stabilization that I have in my camera. Now, typically if I'm shooting a really long lens, I'm going to want to try to prefer faster shutter speeds, so I'll probably tend to open the aperture up as much as I can. I usually do try to stop a lens down at least a stop to a stop and a half to get the best image quality. So like on this f4.5 lens, I might stop it down to f8. It's going to give me a little bit better image quality than wide open, and in bright sunlight I'm still getting a plenty fast shutter speed to use it. Now, I often set my cameras on auto ISO. You can manually set an ISO to give you the shutter speed range you want, and based on the camera you have, how fast you can go on ISO without getting noise. So you kind of have to make some judgments there. But again, with just kind of like any vintage lens, aperture priority is a really good way to go, or manual. You can just manually set everything and look at the exposure in your camera to see if it's correct, and do it that way. But I find, you know, with telephoto lenses, often you're photographing things that are moving, or, you know, and thus if the subject's moving, then your exposure can also quickly change, you know, from shadow to bright sunlight or whatever. So the aperture priority allows me to work pretty fast, and you know, allows me to get good exposures. So that's tip number 5, is set your camera up to get good exposures, you know, without noise, and fast enough shutter speed to make sure you're not getting motion blur. Okay, tip number 6, it's time to take the shot. So how do we do that? You know, today's cameras don't have the old cable release thing, so you can get an electronic cable release. You can, like with the Olympus, I can actually use a phone app to release the camera, if I've got it on a tripod. Often, if I'm just, you know, if I'm hand holding, I'm just gonna do the best I can to, you know, brace my arms against my side, steady the camera, and carefully squeeze off the shot, just like you would, you know, with any camera or any lens. But you have to be, you know, as steady as you can be with a long lens like this, because, you know, motion blur can be an issue. The image stabilization helps, but it won't cure everything if you're moving around too much. So you gotta be careful not to jerk the camera or, you know, move it when you press the shutter button. Just, you know, kind of lock your arms in, squeeze the shutter button carefully to set off the shot. If I've got the camera and lens on a tripod, then I might set a 2-second self timer on here, so I can just press the button and it'll go 1, 2, click, you know, and it'll take a picture, and then nothing's touching the camera, and I can do that. That only works, of course, for static subjects where you don't have to worry about things moving. But if you, you know, if you have the thing on a tripod and your subject is not, you know, in motion, it's not moving, then that 2-second self timer is really easy. Otherwise, you know, again, take some practice, but learn to brace your arms in, lock your arms in, steady yourself. If you can rest the camera on like that monopod, or, you know, brace against some other object, even, you know, lean against a wall or a tree, or anything that you can do to steady yourself, and then carefully squeeze off the shot. And, you know, this is really true of any telephoto lens. You know, today's modern autofocus, you know, lenses, and some, you know, like from Panasonic, have stabilization built into the lens, and they do a really great job, but they won't cure all motion. You can still have motion blur. So you want to try to stabilize yourself as much as you can, carefully squeeze off the shot. You know, if we shoot a lot of wide angle, normal and wide angle lenses, we can get a little sloppy about how we press that shutter button, because, you know, with the image stabilization, you'd have to move things a lot for it to be a problem. But with long lenses like this, you really have to be careful not to move the camera when you're taking that shot, to really carefully squeeze it off and not move the camera. So just some practice doing that, and I think you'll find, especially with the image stabilization in Olympus cameras, that you can actually hand hold some great shots, take some pictures that are just unbelievable. So give it some practice, but squeeze that shot off carefully. That's tip number 6. Okay, those are my 6 tips for successfully taking pictures with long vintage lenses on your Micro Four Thirds or other mirrorless camera. You know, maybe take some practice, but a good lens, a good quality lens like this old Nikkor on that Olympus camera will deliver some good results. It's really amazing how good it can do. And there's a lot of these lenses that are available out there at very reasonable prices, and so you can pick them up and try them out. You know, often, like I say, you can just get bargain basement prices on some of these lenses. And like I said, the cool thing is this 300mm Nikkor on my Micro Four Thirds is actually like a 600mm equivalent. So it really reaches out there, and it's a lot of fun to use. So if you have any thoughts or questions, I'd sure appreciate it if you'd leave me a comment. I always appreciate it when you watch my videos, and I hope you'll join me for the next one. As always, thanks for watching.